a college student with a bright future.
He was a journalism and history major who planned to go to law school.
He had a huge social group. He was very well liked.
Is found murdered in the middle of town.
The wound was so deep, the blade of the knife nicked the spine,
sending police hunting for an elusive killer.
This case was a true mystery, a true whodunit.
He was depicted as a promiscuous young man who could have been killed by anybody.
And when they catch him, it leaves everyone blindsided.
They did not want to believe this was true.
And that was pretty surprising.
When we figured out who did it, I refused to believe it.
Columbia, Missouri is best known as the home of the University of Missouri.
I think many people would consider us a college town. This is a city, small city with 30,000 students, coming in.
For the Columbia Police Department, a neighborhood of rowdy kids is usually as bad as it gets.
Mainly a lot of college-related crimes, such as the parties and alcohol offenses. Homicides in general were unheard of.
That all changes one afternoon in June 2004.
I received a call that someone had found a body in the East Campus area, and because I'm the East District Commander, I headed towards the scene.
Schwartz arrives to find a team of officers already securing the area.
The body was in between two apartments, lying face up, and he only had boxer shorts on. His throat had been slit, most probably with a knife. It was a very large and gaping wound. It was very deep. There's a few other abrasions on the upper body. So it was a very violent action, just a very violent crime.
I was a student in college, and seeing this in a place I knew really well was tough.
The forensics team processes the scene while police search the area carefully, but they can't locate a murder weapon or ID on the body.
We started talking with people in the area to see if anyone knew this particular person.
This was a part of town where everybody really knows everybody else. Everybody knows everybody else's business.
One onlooker thinks they recognize the dead young man.
The body was identified as Jesse Valencia. He was a young man attending the University of Missouri, and we found out that he lived in the neighborhood, block and a half from where we found his body.
The 23-year-old lived alone in an apartment just off campus. Police need to know if that's where the crime got its start.
We opened it up and started to look for any initial type evidence, trying to figure out who could have done this and for what reason.
The forensic team does a thorough sweep of the apartment, bagging Jesse's cell phone, cigarettes, and other items, while police canvass neighbors to see if they noticed anything suspicious the night before.
His neighbor admitted coming home drunk about 3 in the morning and going to bed. He was awakened by yelling that was going on next door. This neighbor actually pounded on the door and then went back to sleep.
The neighbor recalls that the shouting was late, almost 4 o'clock in the morning. Police are curious who was in the apartment with Jesse and what could they have been arguing about.
That obviously started to help us narrow down the time frame of when this may have occurred, but that's all we had to work with at that point.
There were no real clues as to who had murdered this young man.
A few hours into the investigation, another young man arrives at the scene in a flood of tears.
This guy named Jack Barry told investigators he was Jesse's former boyfriend who just lived a few blocks away. A friend had called Jack Barry saying that Jesse was dead.
If he had a relationship with Jesse Valencia, he was definitely a person the detectives wanted to talk to.
Jack agrees to come down to the station for routine questioning. But first, he helps detectives track down Jesse's family in Kentucky.
They called me on the phone, and a detective told me that Jesse had been killed, and I pretty much just took off running through the house and ran out my front door screaming. Just too much. Even when he was a little boy, Jesse never had trouble making friends. Everybody wanted to be around him because he was constantly smiling, laughing, and Jesse told me he was gay when he was 10 years old. He started crying, he got pretty emotional, and he said that he was afraid that I was going to hate him. And I told him that there was nothing in the world that could make me hate him. After that, he seemed pretty comfortable with himself.
As a teen, Jesse's confidence bloomed.
Jesse loved to talk. He loved meeting new people, making new friends. When he was in high school, he wanted to try modeling. He did really well at it, and I always thought that he wouldn't go back to school, but a year from the date that he told us that he wanted to be a model, he said he wanted to be a lawyer. That's what he decided to do, and that's why he went to Missouri.
Linda said he was a journalism and history major who planned to go to law school.
Jesse Valencia was one of those larger-than-life characters. He had such a big personality. He had a lot of friends. He had a huge social group.
Now, detectives need to find out who cut Jesse's life short in such a horrific way. They start by asking Jack Barry about his relationship with Jesse.
Jack told them he and Jesse had just split up, and he was trying to make Jesse realize it's over. I need to move on. Jesse still loved Jack, so he was having a hard time letting go. But Jack was already starting to see someone else.
Was it a fight with a spurned lover that the neighbor had heard in the middle of the night?
It was possible Jack had some type of confrontation with Jesse that led to his death.
And when investigators asked Jack for an alibi, it turns out that he doesn't seem to have one.
His alibi was, I was home sleeping alone. At that point, Jack Barry had become the primary suspect.
Coming up, detectives discover a secret romance
They had started a relationship very quickly.
that uncovers a killer's trail
A lie is the next best thing to a confession.
to a surprising culprit.
It was shocking on many levels.
Detectives in Columbia, Missouri are questioning a man who had recently split up with murdered college student Jesse Valencia.
Jack Barry wanted to end the relationship. He wasn't happy with the relationship any longer.
Jack paints a picture of a couple growing apart after 2 years of dating. But a piece of evidence found at Jesse's apartment makes detectives question his story.
The investigating detectives found Jesse's cell phone, and the cell phone showed that Jesse had called Jack Berry at about 3:18 that night.
The neighbors had heard some type of argument from the victim's apartment, approximately the time frame of when this occurred. So that would be obviously suspicious.
But Jack insists he was nowhere near Jesse's apartment.
Jack said that he had already gone to bed that night and that he heard a knock on his door at 3:18 in the morning, and then he simultaneously got a phone call from Jesse's cell phone. It was routine that Jesse would use his cell phone as sort of a doorbell. Jack said he was tired and he really didn't feel like getting up and talking to his former boyfriend at 3:18 in the morning, so he didn't go to the door.
Jack says he rolled over and went back to sleep, but police aren't so sure and question him for hours.
Finally, Jack broke into tears, and he said he regretted that. He didn't go to the door because what happened might not have happened had he done that. His reaction was so genuine, and it was clear that Jack still had a lot of love and affection for Jesse.
And it's becoming clear to detectives that Jack didn't kill Jesse, but they press him to see if he might know who did.
Jack said that he had no clue as to what would have happened to him and why anyone would have killed him.
23-year-old Jesse Valencia, the MU student.
Police found Valencia's body on East Campus, throat slashed.
As the story of the murder hits the 11 o'clock news, it sends shockwaves through the city.
I would say this was probably one of the most gruesome killings in Columbia. We don't have very many murders here.
The murder of a gay young man just a week before the city's first Pride Fest horrifies the progressive college community.
For anyone who thinks that they can get away with something like this so heinous is just unthinkable. We know from past homicides that a majority of them are with people that they know. Anyone who had had contact with him, whether in a sexual relationship or a social relationship, the detectives wanted to talk to.
Police begin to make the rounds of Jesse's wide circle of friends, wondering if there's anyone in his life that might have harbored any kind of grudge. One name they hear over and over is Zev Feintuck, a student that Jesse had met 2 weeks earlier at a political rally.
Jesse's friends had said, oh, maybe it was this guy because he didn't seem quite normal. There was something that made him a little bit different from other people.
Several of Jesse's friends, they said that Zev wasn't comfortable in his own skin and that he had a lot of issues with being himself. There was some contention whether Zev and Jesse were having a romantic relationship. They were spending a lot of time together.
Rumors about the two young men had been swirling, and after Jesse was murdered, the gossip about Zev began to take a sinister tone.
Somebody saw someone matching his description, looking disheveled and crying, walking down the street the morning of the murder, and a car he was known to drive was seen in that area.
That's when the detectives started looking towards him and started talking with him and seeing what he had to say.
Detectives call Zev down to the station, but he denies that the rumors about him and Jesse are true.
Zev said they'd never had a sexual relationship, but they were friends. Then Zev would come over and he'd hang out with him.
Police questioned Zev about where he was between 3 and 5 a.m.
His alibi was, I was home sleeping. He was a young man who still lived with his parents.
They subject Zev to a voice stress analysis test to see if he is telling the truth.
It showed untruthful, so deceitful. That did seem to be some evidence of guilt.
Detectives quickly follow up with a visit to his parents, but they confirm that their son was home all night.
Zev's parents had said that when Zev would leave, he would always go through the garage door to get to the car, and so it made a big racket They would have awakened his parents, and they said there's no way that he would have left that night. It seemed like he did have an alibi.
With Zev Feintuck discounted as a suspect, detectives continue to piece together the last hours of Jesse Valencia's life.
The detectives were talking with several of the friends of Jesse Valencia to see where he was on the evening and early morning hours that this occurred.
Police learned that Jesse had gone to a party at a friend's house around 11 p.m. on the night he was killed.
Some friends of Jesse said that Friday night, Jesse was at a party with a young man named Ed McDevitt.
Ed McDevitt was somebody Jesse had just met. Ed was a chef in town. They had met just a couple of nights before and had started a relationship very quickly.
Jesse's friends tell police that the two men left the party together, heading in the direction of Jesse's house.
And that was around 3 o'clock in the morning on the last night of Jesse's life.
It appears as though Ed McDevitt might have been the last person to see Jesse alive.
And it was possible Ed McDevitt went home with Jesse and then killed him.
12 hours after finding Jesse Valencia's body, detectives track down 22-year-old Ed McDevitt and bring him down to the station.
Jesse had met Ed McDevitt 2 days before his death and invited Ed to come home with him on that Friday night, the last night of Jesse's life, so he became a suspect at that point.
But Ed claims that he and Jesse went their separate ways soon after they left the party.
And he was talking with Jesse on the phone at the time he was walking home on the last night of Jesse's life.
Ed says that his roommate was up when he arrived home and invites detectives over to talk to him themselves.
There's nothing found when they search his home, and everything Ed McDevitt told the officers, they could verify by looking at his cell phone records, by talking to his roommate, and at that point, investigators let him go.
Police hope the DNA results pending at the lab will help them link one of their suspects to Jesse's murder. Desperate for answers, Jesse's mom grows more despondent, recalling an eerie premonition Jesse had years ago.
From the time Jesse was 7 years old, he had told me that he was going to die at a young age. He said, "I'm going to die at a young age, and I love all of you, and I always will love you, but I'll be okay." He would always end it with, "I'll be okay." And of course I got emotional and upset over it, but he said, "We've got to make the most of what time I'm here."
A day after Jesse's murder, detectives receive the autopsy report and study it closely for clues.
The medical examiner concluded that Jesse had been murdered in the area of 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. The cut to his neck was the only knife wound, and it was the cause of death. And it was so deep, the blade of the knife had also nicked the spine.
The lack of defense wounds suggests that Jesse had been taken by surprise.
The most mysterious thing was that across his breastbone there were bruises, and in the middle of his back between his shoulder blade there were bruises.
The evidence suggests that Jesse was easily overpowered in the vicious attack. Investigators hope that additional lab work will reveal even more and point to a killer.
There were fingernail scrapings collected during the autopsy, and also some hairs were found on his chest, and that was sent to the crime lab for analysis.
Until the crime lab turns up DNA, Police have no choice but to move on to their next lead.
A lot of Jesse's friends were being brought in, they were giving evidence, they were helping out with information.
One of those friends is a fellow student named Andy.
Andy Schermerhorn was a young man who had what they called a friends with benefits arrangement with Jesse.
Andy was out of town the night Jesse was killed. But the day after the murder, he comes forward to share a shocking story.
Andy Schermerhorn told the investigating detectives that Jesse was having sex with a Columbia police officer.
He was having a relationship with an officer. I was surprised.
Andy nervously reveals an encounter 3 weeks prior at Jesse's apartment.
Andy Schermerhorn said that on May 14th, he had been at Jesse's home at night, and there was a knock at the door. And Jesse went to the door, and a uniformed police officer was there. And Jesse said, "It's okay, oh, it's okay, he's cool, he's cool."
According to Andy, the officer took off his gun belt, and the next thing Andy knew, the three of them were fooling around.
After it was over, the police officer said, "This has got to be a secret."
A secret affair between an officer and a murder victim is a major red flag.
If any one of our officers had been seeing Jesse Valencia, why is he not being forthcoming? If you have nothing to hide, why not just tell us?
Detectives need to know who this officer is.
They said, "Do you think you'd be able to recognize him if you saw him again?" And he said yes, because it had only been about 2 weeks since that incident.
Detectives ask Andy if he'll look through a book containing the photo of every officer in the Columbia Police Department.
They were having him walk down the hall where he was going to look at the yearbook. Andy Schermerhorn flipped through it without even looking at the pages, closed it, and Schermerhorn began trembling, and he said, "I passed him in the hallway just now. It was him."
The day after the murder of Jesse Valencia, detectives in Columbia, Missouri learned that he was allegedly having a relationship with a local police officer.
Jesse's friend Andy Schermerhorn told the investigating detectives that he was an eyewitness to this sexual activity. Schermerhorn began trembling, and he said, "It was him that I passed in the hallway just now." And that was Stephen Arthur Rios.
Stephen Rios' commander believes Andy must be mistaken about the officer's identity.
When the detectives told me that maybe Steve had been having a relationship with the victim, I told the detectives, "You're absolutely wrong. He was married to a wonderful young lady, and they had just had their first child."
Schwartz knows the 27-year-old Rios well. The 5-year veteran is one of the department's rising young stars.
Steve was very outgoing. He communicated well, very ambitious.
He was a young officer who was on his way up in the department because he was a go-getter and a very popular officer.
Detectives don't know if Andy is telling the truth, but they're certainly anxious to get Rios' side of the story.
If he was having a relationship, that does not mean that he had killed Jesse Valencia.
Rios is out of town for a couple of days on a camping trip with coworkers. So they begin tracing Rios' steps the day Jesse's body was found.
He went in for his work shift later in the afternoon, like he normally did, and at that point, the body had been found.
The sergeant on duty that day had told me that Rios was coming to the scene to help identify the body. He had contacted the on-duty sergeant, but said he could help.
Rios said that I met Jesse Valencia when I gave him a ticket back on April 18th.
Investigators pull a copy of the incident report to see if it backs up Rios' story.
April 18th of 2004, some friends of Jesse's were having a party, and the party kept getting loud, and the police showed up to get them to quiet down. And Jesse, this intelligent pre-law major, said, "What's your probable cause?" Well, that got him arrested, and Stephen Rios gave him a municipal court summons for obstructing a governmental operation.
A call to Jesse's mother corroborates the report.
Jesse told me that when he was arrested, that the cop that drove him down to the jail was really nice, and that he talked to him all the way down to the station. And he said, I kind of felt a little bit uncomfortable because he kept asking me personal questions about my life that I didn't really feel like he should be asking me when he was trying to arrest me for something.
But the arrest wasn't the end of the officer's interest. The very next day, he turned up at Jesse's apartment.
After he got arrested, Jesse called me on the phone and he said, the cop that arrested me last night showed up on my doorstep. He said he had to ask me some more questions, but the questions he was asking Jesse were more of a personal nature. They went out a few times after that, and he would come to Jesse's apartment and just show up unannounced, even when he was in uniform.
Linda doesn't know much more than that, but thinks that Jesse's friend Joan Sheridan might. When they track her down 2 days after the murder, Joan confirms that Jesse saw the officer more than once after the arrest.
He had told her that the officer would typically come by sometime after 3 o'clock and before 6 o'clock in the morning, just for sex, and then leave.
Joan reveals that she got a close-up look at the officer one night when he showed up at Jesse's place.
They showed her a photo lineup, and she was able to pick the person that came by to Jesse's apartment that night. And it was Stephen Rios.
Detectives now have more evidence that Rios was having a scandalous relationship with Jesse. And when they hear what Joan says next, they suspect he may also have a motive for murder.
Joan said that when he went to court for his municipal court summons, Jesse assumed it would be dismissed since he was having sex with the arresting officer, and it had not been dismissed, and that had angered Jesse. So Jesse had told Joan that the next time the police officer comes over, I'm going to tell him that I have a little secret the chief of police might want to know if he doesn't get that ticket dismissed.
The detectives called me and told me that Jesse was threatening to contact the chief and expose Rios. Finally, the light bulb went off. You start looking at who had a motive to kill Jesse Valencia. Rios was very worried about his job. He was very worried about his reputation. He would be very devastated. He would be embarrassed by this information coming out.
That's when Rios became the suspect.
It's a serious matter to accuse one of their own. Investigators quickly regroup to plan the best approach.
They didn't feel they were ready to interview him yet. They were wanting to have the DNA evidence come back before they actually confronted him. But all of a sudden, Rios showed up at the police department and said, could I talk to you for a second?
He had this look on his face, like he was very upset. Very upset.
Coming up, detectives get a devastating phone call.
Steve called me, crying, very upset, and he said, I've done a bad thing.
And the investigation takes an unexpected new turn.
The officers found him on the 4th floor of a parking garage.
What was he thinking?
Detectives investigating the murder of college student Jesse Valencia are preparing to confront their suspect, police officer Steven Rios. But Rios goes on the offensive first.
Rios said he was hearing from other people that Jesse was having an affair with a Columbia police officer. And I just wanted you to know that I did give him a ticket, but that's the only contact I had with him, and it's certainly not me.
But detectives tell him flat out that they've heard a different story.
They said, we've talked to a woman who said that she was at Jesse's apartment one night when you showed up. Rios sat there for a minute. And then Rios said, well, you know what, we did become social friends, but it never became anything like a sexual relationship. They said, you know, we've talked to another young man who says he was actually having sex with Jesse, and you came by that night and actually came in and joined them on the bed. And Rios said, what, sex? Like it was the most astounding and false accusation you could ever heard.
He was getting very agitated with the detectives. He's a very prideful person, and he was very upset because they didn't believe him.
It's easy to see that Rios is lying. Detectives bear down hard. And finally, their suspect breaks.
Finally, Rios admitted that he had sex with Jesse. He tried to claim it was just that one time, and then it evolved into that he had had sex with Jesse as many as 6 times.
It's a stunning admission and a strong motive for murder.
He was embarrassed. He obviously did not want this information out if he was keeping it secret to begin with, especially from his wife, you know, in his family.
Police may not have the physical evidence to prove that Rios is a killer, but they do have something that's almost as good.
We were able to prove that he was lying.
There's an old saying in law enforcement that a lie, a provable lie, is the next best thing to a confession. And Steven Rios was caught in lots of provable lies.
But detectives aren't finished interrogating their suspect. They ask for his whereabouts the night that Jesse was killed.
He said he had been at work and he got off at 3 o'clock in the morning like he normally did. And he said that that night he'd gone onto the rooftop of the parking garage with a few other officers, and they had drank a few beers before they went home. And he said he got home about 5:15 to 5:30, took a shower, and got in bed.
Detectives grill Rios for over 3 hours, looking for any cracks in his story.
He still maintained he'd had nothing to do with Jesse's death. At that point, investigators let him go. He was definitely a suspect, but the question remained, can we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt?
Investigators' next step is to create a timeline for the night of Jesse's murder and see how Rios' alibi fits in.
His wife corroborated that he had gotten home in that 5:15 to 5:30 time frame.
Other officers confirm Rios worked until 3 a.m. and then had some drinks with them on the rooftop that night. The security door records reveal that Rios left the roof at 4:37 a.m., 45 minutes before he got home.
One of the detectives actually drove from the parking garage to Jesse's home the same time of night, and it was 3.5 minutes. He then drove from the scene of the murder to Rios' home, and it was 10 minutes.
This gave a window of time of 20 to 30 minutes that were potentially unaccounted for at the time that Jesse Valencia was apparently killed.
And this gave us a timeline that could show that Rios could have done this murder within that time.
Investigators search Rios' home, car, and work locker, but they uncover nothing to tie him to the crime. Then, out of the blue, Captain Schwartz receives an alarming phone call.
Steve called me crying, very upset, and he said, "I've done a bad thing." The first question I asked him was, "Where are you?" And he said that he was in Kansas City and that he had bought a shotgun. I really thought he was going to kill himself. And my first reaction was no. I said, "You need to just stop what you're doing. Just come back. Just come back to Columbia and we'll get through it."
Captain Schwartz is able to talk Rios into driving the 150 miles back home, where police take him into custody.
Still wasn't under arrest, but he was put on a 96-hour hold for an involuntary commitment to a mental facility, just for observation to make sure that he wouldn't kill himself.
But Stephen Rios is still despondent. He manages to evade hospital security, and soon the entire Columbia police force is on alert.
I got a phone call that Steve had escaped and was on top of the parking garage, threatening suicide.
One of the officers found him on the 4th floor of a parking garage, and Rios climbed up on the wall, claiming he was going to jump.
When they called me and said he's on top of the garage, he's threatening suicide, what was he doing? What was he thinking?
Suspect in the murder of Jesse Valencia has escaped protective custody and is threatening to lead to his death.
This is one of the busiest parts of campus. It's about 7 o'clock at night. He goes to the roof of the parking garage, starts threatening to jump.
There's a crowd below. There are people watching this. People are videotaping this, taking pictures. It's bizarre.
Police arrive on the scene to try to talk Rios off the ledge.
All I could think of was, here we go again. Why are you putting everyone through this? It was just putting everyone through a nightmare.
After a tense 45-minute standoff, they finally managed to talk Rios back from the brink.
He was taken back into custody and again put into a mental facility and put on a suicide watch while we were finishing our investigation to determine whether or not he would be charged with Jesse's murder.
3 weeks after Jesse's murder, the analysis of the hairs found on Jesse's chest give police the evidence they need to charge Rios with the crime.
They were able to say the persons who left those hairs on Jesse's chest, limb hairs that would have come from somebody's arm, those hairs matched to Stephen Rios. And that's when we realized that they teach Columbia police officers at the training academy how to administer a chokehold, and that cuts off the blood flow to the brain and renders a person unconscious in 3 to 8 seconds. That could account for these limb hairs in addition to the bruises that went across the front of his chest and in the middle of his back.
On July 1st, 26 days after Jesse Valencia's body was found, Stephen Arthur Rios is arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
Did you kill Jesse Valencia?
No, I did not.
During the week-long trial, prosecutors lay out their theory of how the murder went down.
Rios came by after his shift was over, thinking they were going to have sex. Jesse confronted him.
Jesse was threatening to contact the chief and expose Rios.
And he knew his career and his happy marriage would probably be over. And that had angered Rios. The neighbor heard this argument going on, and Jesse's yelling, "Stop it, stop it." Jesse then, clad only in his shorts and barefoot, ran out. being chased by Stephen Rios? The Stephen Rios caught him from behind and choked him into unconsciousness, put him on the ground, cut his throat, and that's what I believe happened in the last minutes of Jesse Valencia's life.
Prosecutors know they have a strong case, but convincing a jury that a police officer is a murderer is sure to be a hard sell.
If even one of the 12 jurors feels like it's not the person, then you have a hung jury or a not guilty verdict.
After 8 long hours, the jury returns with a verdict.
The jury finds the defendant, Stephen Arthur Rios, guilty of murder in the second degree.
I did feel a great sense of relief and even pride when the case was over and Stephen Rios had not gotten away with murder.
Stephen Arthur Rios receives a sentence of life in prison for the slaying of Jesse Valencia.
I don't feel like that Jesse really got justice because I wanted the death penalty for him. He took my whole life away from me.
Anytime you have an officer who has done a heinous type act like this and taken someone's life, it is a huge stain. And for law enforcement everywhere.
For Jesse's mother, her son's legacy is in the way he lived his life, not the way it ended.
I want people to remember the
Across the country, young men were being shot down in cold blood. The killer struck unexpectedly. His attacks were unprovoked. His sole motivation was racial hatred. And after he killed, he vanished.
When a sniper in Utah started targeting African-American men for death, authorities launched a massive investigation. With scant clues and no witnesses, they found the odds stacked against them. And they had no idea where the killer would strike next. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Civil rights violations fall under federal jurisdiction, so the killings become the FBI's business. The investigation soon grew into a nationwide manhunt for a roving serial killer.
Salt Lake City, Utah. On an August night in 1980, 4 youths walked through Liberty Park enjoying the last days of their summer. 20-year-old Ted Fields and 18-year-old David Martin had just finished choir practice. Terry Elrod had just begun dating David a few weeks earlier and had set up her friend Karma Ingersoll with Ted. This was their first date. The four had met to jog in the park, but decided to walk and talk instead. They were too preoccupied with each other to notice a man watching them through the scope of his rifle. When David Martin dropped to his knees, the others thought he was joking. Then Terry felt something sting her arm, and she knew he was deadly serious. Ted told the girls to take cover while he tried to help his friend. Then he too was shot down. Police and rescue units raced to the scene. David Martin, barely alive, was rushed to the hospital, but died hours later of 3 gunshot wounds. Ted Fields, the son of a police chaplain, was dead. Witnesses told police they heard shots coming from an abandoned building across the street. But no one saw the shots fired, and no one saw the gunman. Detectives spoke with Terry Elrod at the nearby trauma center where she was being treated for her wound. She was still badly shaken, but told investigators what she could recall. When she and her friends reached the intersection, she thought she heard firecrackers. David crumpled and she felt a sting on her arm. She saw blood, then realized that David was seriously wounded. As she told her story, she recalled something that had happened a few minutes before the shooting. The group was almost hit by a car traveling the wrong way down a one-way street. But she could not identify the make, model, or license plate, and she never saw the driver. Salt Lake City Detective Don Bell didn't know why the youths were targeted.
These were young boys. They'd never been in trouble with the police. We didn't have an outstanding motive. We didn't know whether it was something related to the girls, whether something related to the boys, or just a case of mistaken identity.
In the morning, police returned to the crime scene to conduct a more thorough search. In a field across from the park, police found tire tracks. Technicians photographed and measured them. Close to the tracks, police recovered 6 bullet casings. Witnesses said they had heard the gunfire coming from the abandoned building. Now detectives believed that what they heard were the echoes. The shooter had apparently hidden in the bushes, lying in wait for the foursome to walk into range. Police matched the casings to the bullets that killed the 2 young men. They sent the evidence to the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C. to determine the type of gun the assassin used. That would take time. Investigators tried to find other leads to the killer's identity. Bell started with the family members of the victims. In particular, Terry Elrod's father seemed like a possible suspect.
You looking for me?
Teach Elrod led an outlaw biker gang and was upset that Terry was dating a black man. Detectives spent 3 days tracking him down.
So where have you been? Hanging out.
When they found him, he agreed to come in for questioning. Investigators were very thorough with him. He said he'd been on a whitewater rafting trip and that friends could back up his story.
What? I did? Just have a seat. Just have a seat. What, am I under arrest or something?
Detectives weren't convinced. They demanded Elrod take a polygraph test.
Find out right now. Have a seat.
He would pass, and his alibi was corroborated. Police had no more suspects. They returned to the Liberty Park crime scene to canvass the neighborhood. One resident, Gary Spicer, told investigators he had seen something suspicious earlier that evening. A car had parked close to his home, and he went out to investigate.
Hey, yo, buddy.
He saw a man packing or unpacking something in the trunk.
What are you doing? What are you doing in my neighborhood?
Spicer asked what he was doing, but the stranger simply shut the trunk and drove away. Spicer didn't see his face, but told investigators that he was a slender white man. He described the car as a Camaro with chrome mags.
Yeah.
Detectives thought the information was promising, since the car was parked close to where they had earlier found the tire tracks. Two days after the murders, police seemed no closer to solving it. Press coverage intensified and community outrage escalated.
We'd never had a homicide like this in Salt Lake City. We had never had people just gunned down, especially young people gunned down in the middle of an intersection. The general public wanted to know about the killings. They wanted to know if they were race-related.
With the possibility of civil rights violations, concern grew in the Justice Department. Assistant U.S. Attorney Steve Snar was brought in to monitor the case.
Members of the black community were particularly concerned and were somewhat vocal about whether this was racially motivated, but at the time there were no clear answers.
FBI Special Agent Curtis Jensen from the Salt Lake City office was assigned to assist local investigators.
When I first heard about this case, I was incensed. It caused a great deal of concern among not just the black community, but all of the community in Salt Lake City. They felt that there was an assassin loose and it could happen again.
As community pressure grew, test results from the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C. offered investigators a fresh lead. Examiners determined that the weapon had been a 6-shot rifle, either a Marlin or Glenfield .30-30. After searching gun shops and classified ads for recent purchases, investigators assembled 150 weapons that matched the description. They tested each one. None had fired the bullets found at the scene. By now, it was likely that the assailant had fled the area and perhaps the state. So the FBI sent out nationwide teletypes to local and federal agencies describing details of the crime, including the weapon and shell casings. With still no suspects, a $50,000 reward was offered to promote the public's help. Calls flooded in. All were checked, none panned out. Most who came forward were after the money and had nothing solid to offer. But one showed a hint of promise. A young woman claimed she might have met the killer. She identified herself as Mickey, a part-time prostitute. She was reluctant to talk to police until Detective Bell assured her she wouldn't be charged if she came in for an interview.
She was actually a struggling college student, and so she would go out 2 days a week and work on one of the streets that a lot of the prostitutes worked on.
She told the detective about a man she had met sometime in August, close to the time of the killings. Mickey was walking down the street when a man in a Camaro pulled up and asked if she wanted to party. She hadn't planned on turning any tricks that day, so she said no. He said he'd make it worth her while. She relented since she needed the money and the man didn't seem threatening. He spoke with a southern accent and introduced himself as Bill Hagman. He drove her to the Regal Inn Motel.
Just getting ready to go.
In the room, Mickey noticed that Hagman had weapons. She described 2 long guns that stood in the corner and 1 silver handgun. Hagman didn't talk about them, and Mickey was afraid to ask. She also said that the man had tattoos on both arms. On his left forearm was an American eagle, on the right, the Grim Reaper. After their stay at the motel, Hagman offered to treat her to lunch, then drive her home. At an intersection on the way to the restaurant, he pulled out his handgun and said something she would never forget.
What's with this guy?
He explained that he was a contract hitman for the Ku Klux Klan and said, "Do you want me to kill those niggers?" She says, "Put the gun away." She was very concerned about what he was going to do. He then says, "It's real easy. I've done work like this before. You just walk up, you shoot them, you walk on. Everybody's concerned with them falling. No one pays any attention to you."
Mickey was terrified, but was able to talk him out of killing the pedestrian. Afterward, Hagman dropped her at her apartment, where he briefly met her roommate. Bell wondered if Mickey was reliable, or just another false witness looking for the reward money. Even if her story was true, Hagman's role in the case was unclear.
Did it have anything to do with our killing, or was this just a bad guy that was blowing through town and trying to, make this part-time hooker be impressed with his ability of being a hitman or something?
If Mickey could identify the long guns she saw in the motel room, her story would have more weight, especially if she identified them as either a Glenfield or Marlin rifle, which the FBI had determined to be the murder weapon. Mickey told Bell she didn't know much about firearms and didn't look at the weapons for very long.
All right, if I had to pick...
The detective insisted she try. But the guns she chose from the photos didn't match either murder weapon. Mickey's story seemed like another dead end. Despite his doubts, Bell made an appointment for her and her roommate to come back and work with a police sketch artist. Meanwhile, investigators continued to pursue the hundreds of leads that poured in. Public pressure was mounting. The community feared that the sniper could strike again, and police didn't know that he already had. Three weeks after the double murder of two young black men in Salt Lake City, the killer's identity remained unknown. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. Local authorities received a response to the national telex sent by the FBI. Police in Cincinnati were investigating a similar unsolved double murder that happened 2 months earlier. On a late evening in June 1980, 13-year-old Dante Brown and 14-year-old Darrell Lane walked to the candy store close to their homes. They never saw the man watching them. Danger struck quickly. They didn't have a chance. Cincinnati police raced to the scene. They found Darrell Lane dead. Dante was still alive, but in serious condition. Both boys had been shot twice. Officers talked to onlookers, hoping someone had seen something, but no one had. Detective Mike O'Brien of the Cincinnati Police recalls that the coroner provided investigators with their first clue.
The coroner responded to the scene, and he had already performed a post-mortem examination on one of the young men and was able to tell the trajectory and the direction the shots were fired in.
The coroner pointed them towards the train trestle 75 feet away. Police combed the trestle. Among the overgrowth, they recovered 4 spent rifle casings. Ballistics analysts determined that they were shot from a .44 Ruger carbine rifle. Months had passed since the double murder in Cincinnati, and detectives had no suspects. No one knew why someone would want to kill the teenagers.
This wasn't the typical homicide. When you have 2 children, 13, 14-year-old children that are shot, sniper-style shooting with no clear motive, 2 children on their way to a candy store. It obviously had the city and the neighborhood in an uproar.
When O'Brien heard about the Salt Lake City sniper, he invited the detectives to Cincinnati to compare the cases more closely. To Salt Lake City Detective Bell, the connection was significant. It revealed a breed of killer not encountered before 1980.
Once we were made aware of this information, we were pretty much convinced that we were dealing with the same killer from back east. And this was actually our real first involvement with what is commonly now referred to as a traveling serial killer. This was a new concept to everybody, not just out in Salt Lake. It was a new concept anywhere in the country that killers would just travel across the country.
While police from both states met in Cincinnati to search for answers, Detective Bell in Salt Lake City followed up on the slim lead from the prostitute named Mickey. She told him that she'd spent time with a man named Bill Hagman at the Regal Inn Motel. He carried guns and drove a Camaro like one described by witnesses close to the crime scene. At the motel, Bell found a registration card signed by Hagman and dated August 16th, 4 days before the murders. The address Hagman listed was in Kentucky.
We had the FBI run the name through their entire database. They had nothing on that name. So we felt fairly confident that everything he'd put on this registration slip was fraudulent.
FBI labs in Washington, D.C. dusted the card for latent fingerprints, but found none. They also analyzed Hagman's handwriting and noted some unique characteristics that would make it easy to identify. They had no proof he was the killer, but he was the only lead they had. Although it was a long shot, a team of 20 detectives spread out to search other motels in the area. They carried copies of Hagman's Regal Inn registration card, hoping to match his handwriting in the event he used a different alias. Agent Jensen recalls the extensive search.
And they conducted a search of all motel rooms from Ogden, which is 30 miles north of Salt Lake, to Provo, which is 30 miles south. And they located about 8 motels where this individual had stayed using false names, each one different, using phony addresses, and using false license numbers for his car.
Local investigators also discovered the suspect had stayed at the Scenic Motel on August 20th, the day of the murders. It was just 9 blocks from the shootings in Liberty Park. Though Hagman used different names at each motel, the FBI labs confirmed the handwriting was the same. One of the cards yielded a fingerprint. But a check in the National Fingerprint Database turned up nothing.
Is this one of your motel registrations?
At the Sandman Motel, they got another break.
Help me out for a second.
Detectives discovered that his registration card listed a Camaro with its license plate number.
Okay, now, I see a license number.
But a second license number was written in the margin by the motel's owner.
Yes, I do. I wrote that number there. That's the correct number.
He must have been in his late 70s, early 80s. He went out every night around 3 o'clock in the morning and would take all of his motel registration slips and walk by all the cars and check their license plate numbers against what were put on the cards, because he was so sure that his guests were going to steal a pillow or a pillowcase.
When the owner checked the plates on Hagman's Camaro against his registration, the numbers didn't match. So he recorded the correct Kentucky plates in the margin of the card. A DMV search revealed the license plate and the Camaro were registered to a member of a prominent Louisville, Kentucky family. The Salt Lake City detectives shared their discovery with detectives in Cincinnati.
Yeah, this is Michael Bryant. How you doing?
They immediately responded to Louisville and made contact with the police agency there and tracked down the actual registered owner of this car. He had in fact sold the car to another person some months before.
The Louisville man showed detectives the sales receipt. Police took down the name of the purchaser, the car's mileage, and its brand of tires. But their troubles weren't over. The purchaser had used a false name. The seller worked with a police sketch artist to render a composite of the buyer, a slender white man with a Kentucky accent. Back in Salt Lake City, Mickey and her roommate were also providing detectives with a composite sketch of the man who called himself Hagman.
At the same time, I met with Mickey, the part-time hook, and her roommate was actually an artist, a student, was studying art, and she did a freehand drawing to begin with. And then we asked her if she could work with our composite, and she did. And she put together a composite of this man.
Hey, Ron, how's it going? How you doing, Mark? All right. What do you got?
When the composite drawing from Louisville arrived in Utah, detectives compared the two renderings.
Good morning. How are you?
They were remarkably similar. Investigators now had the face of the suspected serial killer. Investigators hunted a serial killer who had murdered 2 young African Americans in Cincinnati and 2 more in Salt Lake City. They now had a sketch of their suspect, but lead detective Don Bell still had no name and no hard evidence connecting him with the murders.
We didn't have anything to charge him with. However, we did find a motel that he stayed here in Salt Lake for 2 nights. Since he left without paying, we immediately applied for a warrant, which was granted, and we charged him with defrauding an innkeeper or failure to pay. We issued that warrant under every single name that had been found on every single motel registration card.
The FBI entered the warrant, the license plate, and all of his aliases into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a computer database that links over 57,000 law agencies nationwide. On September 25, 1980, over a month after the Salt Lake City murders, the FBI database paid off. When officers in Boone County, Kentucky arrived at a local motel to arrest a pair of jewelry thieves, the manager told them that one of his patrons was complaining about the lights and noise from their vehicles.
7, 8 police cars in the parking lot with the red lights going and the radios blaring, and another person living in this motel took offense at being disturbed by all this noise and called the manager's office and said, "What are the cops doing there, and how come it's so noisy, and I'm going to leave if you don't quiet down." And so the manager went out and approached one of the Boone County officials and said, "My tenant is really upset that you're causing all this trouble."
When the sergeant asked who was complaining, the night manager told them that the calls were coming from room 80. Perturbed, the sergeant ran the license plate of the Camaro registered for the man in that room. The computer check, tied into the FBI database, turned up the warrant from Utah. Boone County sheriffs went to room 80. A slender, white male with a southern accent answered the door. Inside, officers saw 2 shotguns on the bed. They cuffed him and brought him in for questioning. This time, the fugitive registered with his real name, Joseph Paul Franklin. They notified Salt Lake City investigators that they had their man. Detective Bell and his colleague were on the next plane to Kentucky. But when they arrived, Boone County sheriffs had alarming news. The fugitive had escaped from his low-security room.
At some time during the interview, the detective briefly leaves the room to get something to drink for this subject and himself, and it's at that point that this individual makes his escape out the window and is gone.
Investigators still held his Camaro, his weapons and wallet, containing his driver's license and photo. Salt Lake City Detective Bell recalled how closely the photo matched the 2 composites.
Looking at that license, it was almost eerie. It almost looked like that the composite that had been built in Kentucky and the composite that I built out here in Salt Lake, that we had done it using Joseph Paul Franklin's driver's license.
The suspected serial killer was still one step ahead. The FBI issued a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Investigators hoped the resources of the FBI could stop the killer before he struck again. The fugitive's face and description flooded the media nationwide. Agent Jensen spearheaded the manhunt for the FBI.
He was almost immediately put on the 10 most wanted list because of the notoriety and because of the seriousness of the crime, the fact that he was a suspect not only in this crime, but in the assassination of a number of black people all across the United States. These were cases that hadn't been solved.
To make the most wanted fugitives list, Franklin's file was reviewed among hundreds of others. Special agents at FBI headquarters decide the 10 most wanted based on a suspect's immediate danger to society, that the suspect won't stop killing until he's caught. News of the killer's escape brought a flurry of sightings, including one from a Kentucky teenager. He said a man had offered him $100 to take him across the river to a shopping mall in Cincinnati. Investigators swarmed the mall to interview anyone who thought they'd seen him. They discovered the suspected serial killer had purchased new clothes and had his hair cut and dyed. Franklin had changed his appearance and still had a source of cash. Back in Kentucky, evidence technicians scoured the Camaro for clues. They took photos of its tires, hoping to match them with tread marks found near the crime scene in Salt Lake City. They matched. For Detective Bell, it was a major breakthrough.
The tires were sort of a new prototype that were only being released east of the Mississippi. So for tires to show in a dirt field in Salt Lake City, they would have had to have been purchased at that time east of the Mississippi. That placed that car with that man in our city.
At the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C., examiners analyzed the weapons Franklin had left behind. They hoped to determine that one of the guns was the murder weapon.
He had 2 rifles and 2 handguns. The FBI was able to compare the ballistics of these weapons with the bullets that were recovered from the victims' bodies. These did not match.
The FBI also searched the NCIC database for criminal records and outstanding warrants for Joseph Paul Franklin. They discovered that Franklin had legally changed his name.
Have some more information. What do you got?
His birth name was James Clayton Vaughn. The information allowed investigators to dig more deeply into his past.
Yep.
Joseph Paul Franklin, a suspected serial killer targeting African-American men, had escaped from police in Kentucky and was still on the run. The FBI had determined that he changed his name from James Clayton Vaughn. Agents and local detectives traced his history to his hometown in Birdtown, Alabama. They spoke with people who knew him. For Cincinnati detective Mike O'Brien, a clearer picture of the fugitive started to emerge.
Birdtown is described as basically one side of the track is black and the other side is white. And so there was a lot of racial tension in his upbringing. There was a lot of problems between whites and blacks in that area. His mother had relatives that had been in World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. Franklin, at one point, had said he had read Mein Kampf and was very impressed with this writing.
Joseph Paul Franklin had selected his new name to honor one of his heroes, Hitler's chief propagandist, Paul Joseph Goebbels. The FBI tracked his movements over the previous year and found that they coincided with several unsolved bank robberies.
That's him. That's him.
Agents also learned that 2 years earlier, he had sent a letter threatening to kill President Jimmy Carter because of his pro-civil rights views. The president was currently campaigning in the South, where Franklin had last been spotted. The election was just weeks away. If Franklin was going to make good on his threat, it would be soon. Detective Bell remembers that the FBI and Secret Service rushed into action.
Well, they decided that Joseph Paul Franklin, also James Clayton Vaughn, was definitely a threat to President Carter because he had written that he would like to kill him. So they passed pictures of Joseph Paul Franklin in every city that the president was going to visit.
The FBI had to get to Franklin before Franklin got to the president.
We were able to, through contacting his friends, determine that during the process of his flight, he was selling his blood plasma to obtain money to live on. And as a result of that, we sent bulletins out to all of the blood plasma centers in the southeastern part of the United States.
Clinics across the South received packets from the FBI with information on the killer, now suspected of murder in at least 7 states.
Miss Jackson, are you okay?
I'm just so dizzy.
Okay, well, lay down there for a minute. It's going to take just a few minutes to...
On October 28th, Franklin entered a clinic in the Tampa area to sell his plasma. The technician prepping him recognized the tattoos from the FBI packet, the Grim Reaper and the American Eagle.
Is this your first time giving blood?
Oh my gosh, I'm so dizzy.
Franklin figured selling his blood was safer than robbery for a man on the run.
I do it all the time.
He was wrong.
There is?
The technician phoned the number the FBI provided.
Yeah, okay, great. I'll keep him busy.
Federal agents surrounded the clinic and moved in to arrest Franklin. This time, there would be no mistakes. The killer went quietly without a fight. Franklin was taken to Salt Lake City to stand trial for the murders of Ted Fields and David Martin. But Detective Bell suddenly found the entire homicide case in jeopardy.
The county attorney didn't feel that we had a strong enough case. It was purely circumstantial as far as he was concerned, and he wasn't willing to go to court on just a purely circumstantial case. But the federal government, through the FBI, decided to step in at that time, and they felt that they had a very good, strong case to bring civil rights violations against him.
The civil rights conviction would present obstacles of its own. Prosecutors would have to prove not only that he had committed the homicides in Utah, but that he was motivated out of racial hatred. The FBI held suspected serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin in Salt Lake City, while federal prosecutors built a case to prove his murders were racially motivated. Agents re-interviewed his associates, family, and 2 ex-wives in order to get a clearer picture of Franklin's racial beliefs. Agent Jensen sent his team to Franklin's hometown of Birdtown, Alabama.
We were able to go back and meet with people that knew him, and we were able to develop a history of him, if you will, as to what he was like, the fact that he had been associated with the Ku Klux Klan. He'd been associated with the American Nazi Party. The fact that he'd been arrested a number of times for disorderly conduct, and in some instances because he possessed a weapon.
Prosecutors pursued witnesses who could testify to Franklin's whereabouts and his racist views. At one motel, a manager agreed to speak at trial about his encounter with Franklin.
The police had found a motel where he had stayed before the shooting took place, and he'd gone and registered in the office, and then he went to the room, pulled down the covers, and found a black hair in the bed. This upset him greatly, and so he became irate, went back to the office and yelled and screamed and made a number of racial statements against black people.
Wherever they went, investigators found witnesses who remembered Franklin's car. Assistant U.S. Attorney Steve Snarr recalls that Franklin's Camaro proved crucial to his case.
The car that Mr. Franklin was driving was unique. It had a unique color. It had red pinstriping that was a custom kind of striping. It also had unique interior features and non-standard tires and other features that were noticeable to various witnesses who had observed the car in the Salt Lake area.
And he pulled up and asked
The investigative team also interviewed 2 young women who had ridden in Franklin's Camaro.
We came up with 2 girls, a lady by the name of Sandra and another one by the name of Rhonda, who actually at 4 o'clock, 4:30, 4:45 on the day of the killing, were hitchhiking a couple of blocks away from the park. This man in the Camaro picked them up, and they needed to get to the downtown bank to deposit their paycheck before it closed at 5.
As they got in the car, Franklin asked them if black people hung out in the park. One of the girls, who was dating a black man, said yes. Before he dropped them off, he handed them printed cards that said, "Take off your clothes." Bell sent the cards to the FBI lab, and examiners were able to conclusively match them to similar cards found in the glove compartment of Franklin's Camaro. The timing of the women's story was also compelling.
They actually saw him again that night, a block and a half away from the park at 8:30. So little by little, we're putting him almost in the park at the same time the victims were.
At the Salt Lake County Jail, Franklin was held in a double lockup since he had previously escaped from police custody.
Close 3.
While there, he became friendly with Robert Herrera, an inmate serving time for burglary. Herrera had more recently been disciplined for brawling with a black inmate. Although the fight was not racially motivated, Franklin assumed Herrera held the same hatred of African Americans. He looked to Herrera as a confidant. Agent Jensen recalls the importance of this relationship.
He told Herrera, he confessed to Herrera that he had shot the 2 joggers in Salt Lake City, and also confessed to a homicide in Oklahoma City.
Herrera arranged a meeting with the FBI and local investigators. He had a proposition for them.
How's it going?
Herrera would become a federal witness against Franklin if the state would guarantee his early release. Franklin told Herrera why he shot the couples in Liberty Park. He said he believed people of different races should never mix. When Franklin saw the black men walking with white girls in the park, he felt they should die. Investigators were not convinced they could trust Herrera. A confession to a convict would not ensure a successful prosecution.
You know, we've got one phone for 2 people. We have to coordinate out here too.
When investigators requested more information, Herrera told them about Franklin's whereabouts following the Salt Lake City murders.
Well, I can tell you what he did after the shootings. He did the shootings, he left here, he went north to a town north of Salt Lake, Ogden. He took the freeway across Nevada through Winnemucca, Battle Mountain, Reno, and into San Francisco, and he sold the rifle that he killed the kids at a flea market outside of the Bay Area.
Agents and local investigators needed to confirm Herrera's story. If they could find the rifle Franklin had used in Liberty Park, investigators would have the piece they were missing. Detective Bell sent his team to the flea market outside San Francisco. They interviewed gun dealers and other witnesses.
So they saturated the flea market, and they did come up with witnesses who remembered Joseph Paul Franklin and remembered that he was selling guns. But we could never find the gun.
Even without the weapon, Herrera's story was confirmed. Franklin's movements following the murders would be critical for the prosecution.
Well, this was pretty good information because we'd never been able, the FBI, ourselves, no one had ever been able to find out where Mr. Franklin had gone after doing the killing.
After agents corroborated his story, they met with Herrera again. He told investigators about other crimes Franklin confessed to. Franklin admitted shooting Hustler publisher Larry Flint, crippling him in 1977 for portraying black men with white women in his magazine. Franklin also said he shot Vernon Jordan, the president of the National Urban League, in May of 1980. Federal prosecutors felt they had enough to bring the civil rights case to trial.
Well, the prosecution was an involved prosecution involving 65 witnesses and approximately 100 different exhibits. However, we managed to expedite the case and move things along in telling our story and recreating the actions and things that took place. The trial lasted 5.5 days and we were done.
The jury deliberated just 5 hours, finding Joseph Paul Franklin guilty of the federal civil rights violations. The judge sentenced him to 2 life terms. Franklin was furious that he was going to prison for the rest of his life, but more so because an African-American prosecutor helped put him there. In a rage, Franklin jumped out of his chair and threw water on the attorney. He was quickly subdued by the marshals and carted away. In an interview following his sentencing, Franklin finally admitted to investigators what motivated the killings in Utah and across the country.
He said himself that he is a racist, that he had a plan to assassinate as many blacks as he could. This was his whole purpose.
After the successful federal trial, the Salt Lake County prosecutor felt he could win a state homicide case against Franklin. Franklin was escorted to the courthouse where he had spent the last 2 months during the federal trial. During a recess, he was left unattended in a holding room. Before the court officer returned, he freed himself and pried the door off its hinges. Franklin had escaped.
No one knew how he had escaped from the holding cell. But when the jailers went to bring him back into court before the jury came in, he wasn't in the conference room.
Jeff! Jeff!
It looked as if Joseph Paul Franklin was free once again to continue his path of terror. The elevator was his only way out, and only operable with a guard's key. But a marshal found the control panel dismantled. Franklin had hotwired it using only a dime and a paper clip.
He was able to take the plate off the elevator, the prisoner elevator, and strip the wires and call the elevator to that floor. And then he disappeared.
Police closed off the streets as jailers searched the courthouse for the fugitive.
The rest of us, we immediately put out an area-wide alert that this man had escaped, and we brought every available officer there was scouring the downtown area. At the same time, the jailer decided that maybe he noticed that the top panel on the elevator had been loosened. So he climbed up on top of the elevator and noticed some movement in the dust and thought, well, somehow he's in this building. So that particular jailer started crawling every single air duct in the courthouse.
He found him. Franklin scurried like a rat in the ductwork, always remaining out of his reach. But when Franklin came to the end of the duct, a second guard was waiting.
Got your bracelets right here. Well.
He was back in custody within an hour.
That's it. Get him out of here.
We cleaned him off and combed his hair and brought him back in. And the jury was none the wiser. They just got an extra hour for lunch.
Over his next 17 years in prison, Franklin confessed to 16 murders in 8 states. In all that time, he never admitted to the double homicide in Cincinnati. Detective Mike O'Brien never gave up. He continued to build his case, hoping to convict Franklin of the Cincinnati murders. O'Brien's break came when he was able to convince Franklin to interview with Melissa Powers, an assistant district attorney from Cincinnati.
The minute that Mr. Franklin walked in the room and sat down, and Miss Powers introduced herself, told him who she was, why she was there, he said, "You know I did it. I killed those 2 kids in Cincinnati." Immediately as he sat down, which was what I've been trying to get him to do for some 17 years. He did in a matter of about 30 seconds.
In 1998, Franklin received 2 more life sentences for the Cincinnati murders. In Missouri, he was sentenced to death for 2 others. Franklin would never have another opportunity to escape. Detective Don Bell remained haunted by Franklin's rampage of violence.
I don't understand this type of killer, that he would actually just take a complete stranger, and because of their race and who they were standing by or talking to, he would feel it necessary to kill him. He's one of those few people that I just have absolutely no explanation for, and it's still hard for me to understand.
For the families of Franklin's victims, peace had finally come. Franklin would never be free to kill again.